There is a particular kind of silence that exists in a museum at closing time. The guards have made their final rounds. The lights have dimmed over the display cases. And somewhere in a glass box, on a shelf not much wider than your hand, sits a tablet of baked clay no bigger than a paperback novel. The surface is covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks, thousands of them, pressed into the mud by a reed stylus perhaps 4,000 years ago by someone sitting cross-legged in a room that smelled of lamp oil and bread. That tablet is not decoration. It is not art, not in the way we typically use that word. It is a document. It records a transaction, or perhaps a prayer, or perhaps both simultaneously, because in the world that produced it, those two things were not so different from each other. It was written by people who had invented writing precisely because they needed to keep track of things, of grain and beer and canal repairs and the names of gods who needed to be remembered with offerings each month. Those people called themselves black-headed ones. We call them Sumerians. And among the many things they left behind, the legal codes, the astronomical tables, the love poetry, the flood stories, they also left us a word that has echoed across 4,000 years of human history, mutating and shifting meaning as it traveled, eventually landing, transformed almost beyond recognition, in the middle of late-night television programs and best-selling paperback books. That word is Anunnaki. To understand what it meant at the beginning, you have to understand something about the land that produced it. You have to understand what it felt like to live in a place where the sky was enormous and flat, where rivers did whatever they pleased, and where the line between survival and catastrophe was precisely the width of an irrigation ditch. The region we now call southern Iraq sits at the lower end of two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, where they slow down and fan out across a flat plain before emptying into what we call the Persian Gulf. In ancient times, those rivers deposited enormous quantities of rich silt every spring when the snowmelt in the mountains far to the north sent walls of water rushing south. That silt was extraordinarily fertile. It could grow barley in quantities that seemed almost miraculous to people who had previously scratched a living from drier, harder ground. But the floods were also unpredictable, and the land between the floods was difficult. Without constant management, without dikes and channels and levees and drainage systems, the water either ran away too quickly or accumulated until it turned fields white with salt. The entire agricultural system of ancient Mesopotamia was a continuous negotiation with water. You had to bring it in at the right time, in the right quantity, through the right channels, and you had to let it out again before it poisoned the soil. This is not a metaphor. This is the literal physical reality that shaped everything about Sumerian civilization. When Sumerian poets described the gods as being responsible for keeping the rivers flowing and the fields fertile, they were not being naive. They were doing what humans have always done, reaching for the largest possible explanation for the most urgent possible problem. The earliest settlements in this region date back at least 6,000 years. They were small clusters of reed houses on natural levees, communities that grew from a combination of hunting, fishing, herding, and early agriculture. Over centuries, very slowly at first, then with gathering speed, some of these settlements grew larger. They developed specialization. People began to do one thing rather than everything. A potter made pots. A metal worker made tools and weapons. A scribe kept records. By around 3,500 BCE, the settlement at Uruk, located on the banks of the Euphrates in what is now central southern Iraq, had grown into something that deserves to be called a city. Not a large city by modern standards, perhaps, but a genuine city in the sense that matters. A place where strangers lived near each other, where economic life was organized on a large scale, where buildings served specialized purposes, and where a class of administrators had developed systems for keeping track of everything. Those systems included writing. The first writing we know of anywhere in the world appeared at Uruk around 3,200 BCE. It was not invented to tell stories or preserve poetry. It was invented to count things. Specifically, it was invented to count grain and beer and livestock and labor hours, all the things that a complex administrative economy needed to track. The earliest tablets are essentially receipts and inventory lists, but writing, once invented, does not stay in one place. It seeps into other uses. Within a few centuries, the same system of marks that began by recording 47 jars of oil delivered to the temple of Inanna was being used to record royal titles, divine hymns, legal judgments, and eventually the great mythological narratives that would eventually introduce the world to the Anunnaki. Part 2. The Shape of the Sacred. Before you can understand the Anunnaki, you need to understand how the Sumerians thought about divinity. It was not, in most respects, the way we think about it today. For the Sumerians, the sacred was not separate from the world. It was woven into it, every phenomenon that mattered, the flooding of the rivers, the growth of crops, the movement of the sun and moon across the sky, the unpredictable violence of storms, was understood to be the expression of a divine will or personality. Not metaphorically, but literally. The storm was not caused by a god. The storm was the activity of a god. The distinction that we draw between a natural force and a supernatural being did not exist for the Sumerians in the way it exists for us. This meant that the Sumerian divine world was enormously populated. There were gods of rivers and gods of specific sections of river. There were gods of city walls and gods of particular gates in city walls. There were gods of plows and gods of the furrow the plow made. There were gods of the scribal art and gods of specific types of fish. But within this vast pantheon, there was structure. There was hierarchy. Some gods were ancient and powerful and presided over the fundamental architecture of existence. Others were younger and more specific in their responsibilities. And at the very top of the divine organization, at the level where the most fundamental decisions about how the world would work were made, sat the group that the Sumerians called, among other names, the Anunnaki. The word itself is usually translated as something like the offspring of An, or the princely seed. An was the sky god, the oldest, most remote of the divine powers, the god who represented the vault of heaven itself. In the Sumerian cosmological scheme, the universe began as a single undivided entity in which sky and earth were fused together. The separation of sky from earth, a kind of cosmic birth, was the first great act of creation, and from that separation came the possibility of everything else. An and Kai, sky and earth, were not merely metaphors for space and ground. They were understood as the primal parents of the divine family. The Anunnaki were their children. And like children in any family, they ranged widely in character, temperament, and responsibility. But they shared a common ancestry that made them together the fundamental governing powers of the world. At the head of this divine family, in practical terms, the god who actually ran things day to day was not An, who tended to be remote and ceremonial, but Enlil. He was the god of wind and air, which in Sumerian cosmology meant he was the god of the space between sky and earth, the medium through which things actually happened. His city was Nippur, located roughly in the center of the Sumerian heartland, and it functioned in the Sumerian religious imagination as a kind of cosmic headquarters, the place where the great assembly of gods met to deliberate about important decisions. Enlil was not a comfortable god. He was powerful and authoritative and capable of great mercy, but he could also be frightening. Sumerian hymns praise him as the source of all authority and all civilized order, but they also acknowledge that when he was displeased, the consequences could be catastrophic. Enlil was the god who, in the Great Flood story, decided that humankind had become too noisy and had to be largely destroyed. Balancing Enlil, in the way that a temperamentally different sibling sometimes balances an older child's severity, was Enki. His Akkadian name was Ea. He was the lord of the Abzu, the deep freshwater reservoir that the Sumerians believed lay beneath the earth, from which springs and rivers drew their water. Enki presided over wisdom, magic, craftsmanship, and the practical arts that made civilization possible. His city was Eridu, at the southernmost end of the Sumerian plain near the ancient Gulf Coast, at the place where sweet water and salt water met. Enki was, in narrative terms, the most interesting of the great gods. He was clever in the way that the most useful people are clever, not just intellectually quick, but practically ingenious, always finding a path through problems that seemed to stump everyone else. He was also, repeatedly, the god who intervened on behalf of humanity when the more severe members of the Divine Council had decided that people needed to be punished. He did not always do this openly. He found ways around rules without technically breaking them. He was, in the stories, and something that the Sumerians apparently valued enormously, a wise friend with influence who would help you without putting himself in an impossible position. Then there was Nin-Hersag. She went by many names, including Ninma and Mami, who was the great mother goddess, the divine midwife, the one who presided over birth and growth and the vitality of living things. In some traditions, she was the earth itself. In others, she was a distinct deity who worked alongside Enki when new life needed to be shaped. She was one of the four primary deities alongside An, Enlil, and Enki, and her presence in any story about creation or growth was understood as essential. Around these four central figures gathered the rest of the divine family: Nana, the moon god, who kept time and whose great temple at Ur made that city one of the most important religious centers in the world; Utu, later known as Shamash, the sun god and divine judge, who traveled across the sky each day, seeing everything that happened beneath him, and who was therefore the natural patron of justice and the settling of disputes; and Inanna, later known as Ishtar, who was perhaps the most complex figure in the entire Sumerian pantheon, goddess of love and desire and sexuality, but also of war and ambition, and the kind of fierce energy that builds cities and then sometimes tears them down. These were not abstract principles wearing the costume of personalities. They were, for the Sumerians, real beings, with genuine characters who cared about what happened in the world and who intervened in human affairs constantly. The temple in each city was not merely a house of worship, it was literally the house in which the god lived, their primary residence on earth, where they were present in the form of their cult statue, where they ate the offerings that priests prepared each day, where they received visitors and heard petitions, and from which they managed the affairs of the city that was theirs. The Anunnaki, as a collective concept, the high assembly of the great gods, functioned in Sumerian thought as a kind of supreme governing body, a divine council that met when decisions of cosmic importance needed to be made. The tablets do not give us a fixed membership list for this council, because the composition varied across centuries and regions. But the idea was consistent. When something fundamental was being decided, the fate of a kingdom, is the outcome of a war, the punishment for some great offense, the Anunnaki convened, deliberated, and issued a decree. That decree, once spoken, was binding in a way that no human authority could override. Part 3. The Gifts of Civilization. One of the most revealing ideas in Sumerian religion is something called the Me, sometimes written as Mi, and often translated as divine ordinances or the gifts of civilization. The Mi were a specific category of power, not the raw force of a thunderstorm or the physical energy of a river, but the organized, purposeful powers that made human culture possible. The lists of Mi that appear in various Sumerian texts are remarkable documents. They include obvious items like kingship, priesthood, and temple administration, but they also include things like music, the descent to the underworld, the scribal art, the smith's craft, and sexual intercourse. And they include some items that seem troubling to a modern reader, things like lying, the spreading of enmity, and the stirring up of discord. These too were divine ordinances. They too had been deliberately placed in the world as part of its necessary structure. What this tells us is that the Sumerian theological imagination was not primarily interested in a simple division between good and evil. It was interested in function. A world that worked required all these elements. Conflict was as necessary as harmony. Competition was as necessary as cooperation. The Mi were not a list of virtues. They were a catalogue of the essential operating components of a functioning civilization, the good alongside the difficult. In the great story of Enki and the world order, which survives in a long and somewhat damaged Sumerian text, we see these powers being distributed. Enki tours the world and assigns responsibility for different domains to different divine powers. He appoints guardians for rivers and marshes. He designates which gods will oversee grain production and which will watch over cattle. He organizes the divine labor in a way that ensures everything necessary will be attended to. It is, among other things, a creation story. But what is being created is not the physical world so much as the managed, organized, civilized world. The story of Inanna and the me goes further and is funnier and perhaps more honestly human. In this tale, Inanna, ambitious, energetic, never content with what she has, travels to Eridu to visit Enki. They drink together, and a long and apparently excellent evening of divine hospitality. As the beer flows and Enki grows relaxed and generous, he begins to give Inanna, the me, one after another, in the warm hospitality of the moment. Inanna accepts each one graciously. In the morning, Enki wakes up and realizes what he has done. He sends his minister to try to get the me back, but Inanna is already on her boat, heading home to Uruk with the full kit of civilization in her hold. The pursuit fails. Uruk receives the gifts. The city flourishes. There is something deeply familiar about this story. It is, in one reading, a story about how Uruk came to be the preeminent city of its era. The gifts of culture flowed there, the city was blessed. But it is also a story about the movement of cultural power, about how one city's rise can be understood as both a political fact and a cosmic event. And it is a story about a god, Enki, who is wise but not infallible, who acts generously but sometimes without full calculation, who must then watch the consequences unfold without being able to reverse them. These are not the characteristics of an omniscient, omnipotent deity. They are the characteristics of a very powerful person, someone whose decisions matter enormously and who generally knows what they are doing, but who is also, in some fundamental way, working with the same imperfect information and the same mix of intention and circumstance that we all work with. That quality, divine power combined with something recognizably human in its texture, runs through all of Sumerian theology. The Anunnaki are not remote, abstract principles. They are a family. They have relationships with each other that can be warm or contentious, cooperative or competitive. They make decisions that seem right at the time and occasionally turn out to have been mistakes. They are capable of regret. They sometimes change their minds. Part 4. The Making of Humanity. In the beginning, so the stories tell us, there was work to be done and no one to do it. Not no one. The gods themselves existed, but they were, in the Sumerian cosmological scheme, too important for the grinding physical labor that the world required. The canals needed digging, the fields needed watering, the temples needed cleaning and supplying. Someone had to do all of this. For a time, the lesser gods, the Igigi, did it. These were the younger, lower-ranking members of the divine workforce, the ones who served the great gods and handled the practical management of the world. But even divine laborers reach a limit. The Igigi worked for a long time, and then, one night, in one of the most vivid passages in all of ancient literature, they put down their tools. The rebellion of the Igigi is described in the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest narrative poems we possess. The workers gather at night, they burn their tools, they march on Enlil's house at Nippur, they bang on the gate, they refuse to return to work until their situation is addressed. It is impossible to read this passage in its context. In a civilization built on large-scale organized labor, on corvée work crews dredging canals and building temple walls, on the careful management of thousands of workers through rationing and scheduling, without feeling that this story is also, in some sense, about human laborers. The grievance is universal. The work is too hard and too endless. Something must change. What changes in the Divine Council's deliberation is the creation of humanity. Enki proposes the solution. He will make a new being, not a god, but not merely an animal either. A creature capable of understanding instructions, of learning crafts, of working with intention and skill. To give this new being the necessary qualities, to give it the spark of comprehension that separates purposeful labor from mere movement. Something of the divine must be mixed into its making. The account in the Atrahasis epic is explicit about this. A god is sacrificed. His blood and his intellect are mixed with clay from the Abzu, the sacred deep fresh water, and from this mixture, the first human beings are formed. Ninhursag, the great mother goddess, does the shaping. The birth goddesses carry the new beings through the appropriate gestation period, and then, into a world that has been waiting for them, the first humans emerge. They are given work immediately. This is, of course, not how a modern reader would choose to tell a creation story. We tend to prefer origin stories that emphasize human dignity and divine love. The Sumerian version is more matter-of-fact and, in some ways, more honest. Human beings exist to do work that needs doing. That is not an insult to humanity. In a civilization that considered organized labor sacred, where canal maintenance was a religious duty, and where offering the gods their daily meals was the holiest act anyone could perform, work was not degrading. Work was the medium through which humanity participated in the maintenance of the divine order. But the story also contains something else. The blood of the sacrificed god does not merely provide a convenient binding agent for the clay. It transmits something. The divine intellect that was in that god passes into every human being who descends from this first making. This is why humans can understand the gods, can communicate with them, can participate in ritual in a way that actually reaches the divine. This is why prayers are heard. Humanity is not just a labor-saving device. It is a new kind of being, made from both earth and sky, standing between the world of matter and the world of the divine. The story continues past the creation itself into the complications that followed. Humans multiplied, the world filled with people and with their noise, and the noise began to trouble the gods, particularly Enlil, who valued order and quiet. The divine council debated what to do about the human population problem. Several solutions were tried: disease, drought, famine. Each time, Enki quietly helped the humans find ways to survive. Each time, the population recovered. Finally, the decision was made for a flood. Part 5. The Flood and the Covenant. The Great Flood story of Mesopotamia is one of the most important narrative texts in human history, not because it is unique, but precisely because it is not. Versions of this story appear across an enormous range of cultures and traditions, but the Mesopotamian version is by far the oldest, predating the biblical account of Noah by at least 1,000 years. And the essential structure of the two stories is so similar that no serious scholar believes this is coincidence. In the Sumerian and later Akkadian versions, the decision to send the flood comes from the divine council. The Anunnaki, led by Enlil's insistence, agree that humanity must be largely destroyed. The oath of secrecy is sworn. No god will warn the humans of what is coming. This oath puts Enki in a difficult position, because Enki has, throughout the history of his relationship with humanity, been their protector and advocate. He cannot break the oath he has sworn to the divine assembly, but he finds a way around it. He goes to the house of a wise man. In the Sumerian version, this man is called Ziusudra. In the Akkadian version, from the Atrahasis epic, he is Atrahasis. In the later version preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he is Utnapishtim. The names differ. The essential figure is the same. He is a man of exceptional wisdom and piety, the kind of person that gods trust. Enki does not speak to the man directly. That would violate the oath. Instead, he speaks to the wall of the man's reed house, knowing, of course, that the man is on the other side of that wall and will hear everything. It is one of the great pieces of divine legal maneuvering in ancient literature. The letter of the oath is kept. Its spirit is circumvented. The man hears what he needs to hear. The instructions are practical and specific. Build a boat. Not just any boat. A sealed vessel with dimensions given precisely, made waterproof with bitumen, capable of carrying not just the builder's family, but the seed of every living thing. The man follows the instructions. He hires workers, pays them generously, explains the project as a work of religious devotion. He loads animals and craftsmen and seed grain and all the accumulated tools and knowledge that would be needed to rebuild a civilization from nothing. The storm comes, the flood comes. The text describes the violence of the waters with a kind of terrified grandeur. The land torn apart, the people swept away, the world reduced to a featureless ocean. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the great sealed vessel rides the surface, the last ark of everything that had been built across the centuries since the first humans were made from clay and divine blood. Then the waters recede. The vessel comes to rest on high ground. The man opens a hatch and looks out. He sends birds to test whether dry land has appeared, first a dove, which returns, then a swallow, which returns, then a raven, which does not return because it has found a place to land. The man opens the vessel and steps onto solid ground. He makes a sacrifice. He piles up sweet-smelling wood and burns offerings on it, and the smoke rises into the sky, and the gods come to the smell of it. The image at this point in the Atrahasis version is remarkable and, on first reading, almost shocking. The text says that the gods gathered around the offering like flies. It says that the great gods had been hungry during the flood because there were no humans to bring them offerings, no temples staffed with priests, no daily meals prepared for the divine household. The flood that was intended as a punishment for humanity had turned out to be an inconvenience for the gods as well. There is something important in this moment of honesty about divine motivation. The gods need humanity. The relationship is not purely hierarchical in one direction. It is a reciprocal arrangement. Humans work the fields and tend the temples and make the offerings. The gods maintain the order of the world that makes those fields productive. Neither side functions without the other. Enlil, arriving at the sacrifice and seeing that a human has survived, is furious. Someone has broken the oath. Enki steps forward. He defends what he did on the grounds of proportionality. Was it really necessary to kill everyone? Were there not other ways to manage the population problem? He proposes alternatives, shorter lifespans, periodic bouts of infertility, natural limits on how crowded the world could become. Things that would keep humanity within manageable bounds without destroying the entire arrangement. The flood survivor and his wife are given a form of immortality and placed at the edge of the world, where the rivers run into the sea. They become a kind of standing exception to the rule, proof that the gods can show mercy, and a reminder that the human situation, difficult as it is not without grace. And from that point, the world begins again. The cities are rebuilt. The canals are cleared, the temples are restaffed. The Anunnaki resume their positions in the Great Assembly, the decrees go out, the destinies of cities and rulers are assigned, and the complex, difficult, beautiful, dangerous world of Mesopotamian civilization continues its work. Part 6. Babylon and the Elevation of Marduk. For most of the 3rd millennium BCE and the early 2nd, the dominant cultural and religious idiom of Mesopotamia was Sumerian. Even as the language of daily life shifted toward Akkadian, a Semitic language quite different in structure from Sumerian, the religious vocabulary, the great mythological stories, and the intellectual framework of the divine assembly retained their Sumerian character. The gods kept their Sumerian names or acquired Akkadian equivalents that carried the same essential meanings. Then something changed. A new city rose to prominence on the middle Euphrates, and with it came a new way of telling the old stories. Babylon had been a significant settlement for centuries, but it became genuinely important in the early 2nd millennium BCE under a line of Amorite rulers whose most famous representative was Hammurabi. Hammurabi is known today primarily for his law code, a magnificent stele on which nearly 300 legal judgments are inscribed in cuneiform. But he was also a skilled military and political strategist who unified most of Mesopotamia under Babylonian control. His city became, under his rule and his successors, the undisputed center of Mesopotamian civilization. When a city becomes the center of civilization, its patron god tends to become the most important god in the pantheon. This had happened before, i.e. in various Sumerian cities. What made Babylon different was the thoroughness and literary ambition with which the theological transformation was accomplished. The great creation epic Enuma Elish, its name taken from its opening words meaning "when on high," is one of the most sophisticated works of ancient religious literature. It was composed, scholars believe, sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE, probably during or after the reign of Hammurabi, and it served a specific theological purpose, to explain why Marduk, Babylon's patron god, was not merely an important deity, but the supreme ruler of the cosmos, the god who had created the world and who held absolute authority over all other divine powers. The story Enuma Elish tells begins, as Sumerian creation stories did, in a time before the world was organized. The primordial state is described as a mixing of two waters, Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water, from which the first gods were born. The younger gods are noisy and troublesome, disturbing the rest of Apsu, who decides they must be destroyed. The plan is discovered, Apsu is killed before he can act. Tiamat, enraged at the death of her consort, gathers her own forces, a host of monsters, each more terrible than the last, led by her champion Kingu, to whom she gives the Tablet of Destinies, the sacred object that confers cosmic authority. The established gods are terrified. They try one champion after another, and each fails. Finally, the young god Marduk comes forward. He will face Tiamat, but only if, should he succeed, the gods acknowledge him as their eternal lord. The agreement is made. Marduk faces Tiamat in a confrontation of cosmic proportions. He traps her with a net. He drives a wind into her open mouth. He kills her with his spear. And then he creates. He splits Tiamat's body and from the two halves forms the sky and the earth. He organizes the stars and planets into their courses, establishing the calendar and marking the year. He arranges the winds and the clouds. He creates the rivers from Tiamat's eyes. He sets up the heavens as a great dome and places astronomical stations for the major gods. He works, in short, as a divine architect of stunning competence, imposing order on chaos with each decision. There is still the question of labor, of who will do the practical maintenance work that keeps the world running. Marduk addresses this directly. He takes Kingu, the leader of Tiamat's forces, and from his blood creates humanity. The connection between divine blood and human creation is exactly what the older Sumerian stories contained, but now it is Marduk who oversees it, and it is the blood of a rebel and a traitor that becomes the material of human existence. People will carry the work. The gods will be free. The assembled gods, grateful and awed, give Marduk 50 names, each one a title that encompasses a particular function or power. These 50 names are listed in the final section of Enuma Elish in a kind of formal ceremony, each god in the assembly rising to pronounce a name and its meaning. It is both a theological statement and a liturgical act. By speaking the names, the gods confirm their own subordination to Marduk's authority, and the text confirms for its audience that the god of Babylon legitimately holds power over all things. The Anunnaki appear in Enuma Elish in a transformed role. They are no longer the primary council of divine authority. They are, instead, the grateful beneficiaries of Marduk's victory, gods who had been threatened by Tiamat's rebellion and who are now protected and organized by their new supreme lord. The text mentions them being assigned stations in the heavens and on earth, 300 above and 300 below, a neat accounting that reflects Babylon's love of organized symmetry. What had been a council of more or less equal senior powers, an assembly that deliberated and reached collective decisions, had become a household staff serving a single supreme king. The political implications were not subtle. A city governed by a great king, served by subordinate officials who owed their positions to royal appointment, would naturally prefer a universe organized on the same principle. Part 7. The Descent and the Dark Court. Not all the Anunnaki sat in the bright assembly of the heavens. As Mesopotamian religious thought developed across centuries, a parallel world emerged in its imagination, a realm beneath the earth where the dead went, ruled by its own monarchs and judged by its own divine authority, and increasingly it was the Anunnaki who sat in that court of final judgment. The story of Inanna's descent to the underworld is one of the oldest and most psychologically complex narratives in human literature. In it, Inanna, Queen of Heaven, goddess of love and war, the most powerful female deity in the Sumerian pantheon, decides, or for reasons the text leaves somewhat ambiguous, to visit the realm of the dead. This realm is ruled by her sister Ereshkigal, and it is described as the Great Below, the land of no return, a place of darkness and dust where the dead exist as shadows of themselves. To enter the underworld, Inanna must pass through 7 gates. At each gate, she is required to remove a piece of her regalia, her crown, her lapis lazuli necklace, her breastplate, her golden ring, her lapis measuring rod, and so on. With each removal, she becomes less powerful, less divine, less protected. By the time she has passed through all 7 gates, she arrives before Ereshkigal stripped of everything. And there, in the court of the Great Below, she faces 7 judges. These judges are called the Anunnaki of the underworld, and their judgment is absolute. They look at Inanna, they pronounce their verdict, and she is killed, the goddess of life itself, brought to death in the realm of the dead, hung on a hook to rot. The story does not end there. Enki, ever resourceful, creates beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails and sends them to rescue Inanna. They descend, find her body, revive her, and begin the long process of negotiating her release. Inanna returns to the world above, but not without a price. The laws of the underworld require that a substitute go down in her place. She must return accompanied by the demons of the underworld, and she must choose who will take her place. The story ends with a choice that reveals something important about the Sumerian vision of divine relationships. Inanna chooses her husband Dumuzi, who had not properly mourned her death. The personal and the cosmic intersect in a moment of terrible intimacy. But what matters for understanding the Anunnaki is the image of those 7 judges in the underworld court. They are not the terrifying monsters that many other ancient cultures placed at the gate of death. They are judges. They have procedures. They hear cases and reach verdicts. The realm of death is, in the Mesopotamian imagination, a place of order. Grim order, unavoidable and absolute, but order nonetheless. The same powers that maintain the divine assembly in heaven also maintain the court of the dead below. This duality, the Anunnaki, as both the assembly of the living gods and the judges of the dead, reflects something fundamental about Mesopotamian theology. Justice could not be limited to the world of the living. Crimes committed in secret, wrongs that the earthly courts never addressed, debts that went unpaid, all of these would eventually come before the judges below. The divine order extended all the way through existence, from the highest heaven to the deepest darkness. In the later first millennium, BCE, as Babylonian and Assyrian theological thinking became increasingly systematized, scholars begin to encounter a clear terminological distinction: the Igigi for the gods of heaven, the Anunnaki for the gods of the underworld. The old term, which had once designated the supreme assembly of the high gods, had migrated downward in the cosmic hierarchy as Marduk and his court took over the administration of heaven. The shift illuminates something important about how living religious traditions work. Terms do not die, they adapt. The authority that the name Anunnaki carried, the gravity, the antiquity, the sense of absolute and final judgment made it exactly the right word for the judges of the dead. The power of the name traveled from one function to another, carrying its weight with it. Part 8. The Rediscovery. For almost 2,000 years, the civilization that had produced the Anunnaki lay buried under its own rubble. The great mud-brick cities of Mesopotamia, abandoned after the conquest of Alexander and the subsequent shifts in political and economic power, slowly dissolved back into the earth from which they had been made. The mounds that remained, the tales of archaeology, were unremarkable to the eye. Local farmers sometimes found baked bricks that they reused in their own buildings. Travelers occasionally mentioned strange ruins in the flat landscape, but no one read the tablets. No one knew they were there. The rediscovery of ancient Mesopotamia was one of the great intellectual adventures of the 19th century. It began with a problem. Scholars who studied the Bible and ancient history knew, from classical sources, that Nineveh and Babylon had existed. They had some vague accounts of what those cities had been like, but they had no direct access to the cultures themselves. No one could read the writing on the monuments. no one knew which mounds concealed which ruins. Several things changed simultaneously. European scholars examining the trilingual inscriptions that Persian kings had left on cliff faces, texts in Old Persian, Babylonian, and Elamite, realized that these might be deciphered using the same method that had cracked the Egyptian hieroglyphics. The Old Persian was the key. Its language was related to known languages, and with effort, it could be read. Once Old Persian was understood, the Babylonian column of the inscriptions could be approached systematically. The great breakthrough came at a cliff face at Behistun in what is now western Iran. A Persian king named Darius had ordered a massive inscription carved there in the 5th century BCE, celebrating his victories. Henry Rawlinson, a British army officer with an extraordinary combination of physical courage and scholarly temperament, spent years scaling the cliff, copying the inscription and working out its meaning. By the 1840s and 1850s, he had made the Babylonian column legible, and with it, the entire ancient Near Eastern record became accessible. At the same time, the physical excavation of Mesopotamian sites was beginning. Paul-Emile Botta dug at Khorsabad and revealed an Assyrian palace with relief sculptures of a scale and quality that astonished European audiences. Austin Henry Layard worked at Nimrud and then at Nineveh, where he found the library of Ashurbanipal, a vast collection of clay tablets that the last great Assyrian king had assembled from all over the ancient world as a deliberate act of cultural preservation. That library changed everything. It contained copies of texts whose originals stretched back 1,000 years and more before Ashurbanipal's reign. And among those texts were the great mythological narratives, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis epic with its creation and flood story, hymns to the Anunnaki and to Enlil and to Inanna, astronomical omen series, ritual texts, legal codes. George Smith, working in the British Museum on the Nineveh tablets in 1872, recognized a narrative he had not expected to find. Piecing together fragments of the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, he read the story of a great flood, of a man warned by a god, of a boat built to preserve life, of birds sent out to test the waters. He had, in the ruins of an Assyrian library, found a text that predated the biblical flood narrative by centuries and told essentially the same story. Smith's announcement caused a sensation. The Illustrated London News published his findings. The Times followed. A public that had grown up believing the Genesis flood account to be unique suddenly confronted the possibility that the story had deeper, older roots than anyone had imagined. Within a year, Smith had returned to Nineveh specifically to find more fragments of the flood text, and had found them within days of beginning his search, which was either extraordinary luck or the result of the fact that a major Assyrian library contains rather a lot of tablets. The work of reading the tablets proceeded over the following decades with accumulating speed. The Sumerian language, once decoded, revealed a tradition even older than the Akkadian texts. Scholars like Thorkild Jacobson and Samuel Noah Kramer devoted careers to bringing the Sumerian literary tradition into the light. Kramer's translation work, in particular, transformed the field's relationship with the public. His ability to render ancient Sumerian poetry into readable English without falsifying its character allowed general readers to encounter the gods of ancient Mesopotamia directly, in their own voices. The Anunnaki, as they emerged from this process of recovery, were recognizable immediately as a genuine ancient concept, not the invention of any particular scribe or school, but a term that appeared across centuries and genres, from royal hymns to legal oaths to mythological narratives. They were the high council of the divine assembly in their oldest appearance, and the judges of the underworld in their later one. They were the guarantors of cosmic order, the powers to whom oaths were sworn, the names invoked when something absolute and binding was needed. Archaeology reinforced what the texts described. Excavations at Nippur, but where Enlil's great temple had stood, revealed a complex of courts and storerooms and shrines that matched the administrative picture the hymns provided. At Leonard Woolley's work revealed both the physical grandeur of the ziggurat and the remarkable contents of the royal cemetery, gold and lapis lazuli, extraordinary musical instruments, and the grim evidence of attendants who had gone to their deaths alongside their kings in rituals that connected human power to divine favor in the most direct possible way. At Eridu, the deepest levels of excavation revealed the oldest known temples in Mesopotamia, small mud brick shrines that had been built and rebuilt on the same spot over thousands of years, layer after layer, each new temple incorporating the ruins of its predecessor in a continuous act of sacred memory. Part 9. The Theology in Daily Life. It would be a mistake to think of the Anunnaki as a concept that lived only in great literary works or in the formal liturgies of major temples. The divine assembly was woven into the fabric of daily life in ancient Mesopotamia in ways both practical and deeply personal. Consider the oath. In Mesopotamian legal practice, oaths were the fundamental guarantee of truthfulness and commitment. When a contract was concluded, when a boundary was established, when a testimony was given in court, the parties involved swore by the gods. And the gods they swore by were frequently the Anunnaki, not as an abstract collective, but as a real and present audience for the promise being made. The divine council was, in this sense, the ultimate notary public, the cosmic witness whose presence transformed a merely human promise into an absolutely binding commitment. The boundary stones called kuduru, stone stelae that recorded land grants and were often carved with divine symbols, invoked the Anunnaki in their curse formulas with remarkable specificity. Anyone who altered the inscription, removed the stone, or violated the land grant recorded on it would face punishment not just from one god, but from the entire divine assembly. The curses are lengthy and creative in their descriptions of the misfortunes that would follow. They reflect a society that understood property rights as divinely guaranteed, which meant that to steal a man's field was not just a civil wrong, but a cosmic offense. The Anunnaki also appeared in the divinatory practices that were so central to Mesopotamian decision-making. Divination, the art of reading divine intentions from physical signs, was one of the most sophisticated intellectual enterprises of the ancient Near East. Babylonian and Assyrian scholars produced enormous series of omen texts that catalogued every conceivable natural phenomenon: celestial events, the appearance of animal organs, unusual births, the behavior of oil on water, alongside the human outcomes that those phenomena were held to predict. The theoretical foundation of divination was the idea that the gods had organized the world as a coherent system in which events were connected across different levels of reality. A reddish halo around the moon on a particular night was not just an atmospheric phenomenon. It was a sign that the divine council had made a decision that would manifest in human affairs in a predictable way. The omen scholar's job was to maintain the catalogue of correspondences that made those predictions possible. The great celestial omen series Enuma Anu Enlil, named for its opening words and running to more than 70 tablets, is one of the most impressive products of this tradition. It records thousands of astronomical observations and their associated predictions. The fact that the series is named for An and Enlil, two of the senior Anunnaki, is not incidental. The celestial sphere was their domain. The signs in the sky were their communications. Illness, too, was understood in divine terms. Medical texts from Mesopotamia reveal a system in which disease was interpreted as the result of divine disfavor, either punishment for some offense or the work of demons who operated under divine license. Treatment involved both practical remedies, herbal preparations, physical procedures, and ritual ones, prayers, exorcisms, apotropaic rites. The healer who combined both approaches was following a coherent theory of causation, not mixing incompatible systems. The divine and the physical were not separate categories. Enlil's anger could manifest in a fever. Enki's restoration could work through the hands of a skilled physician. The management of the annual calendar was perhaps the most pervasive way in which the Anunnaki structured daily life. Each month had its sacred occasions, particular days on which specific gods required specific observances, days of good omen and days of ill, days for beginning new projects and days for avoiding action. The lunar month was the basic unit, with new months beginning at the first visible crescent of the new moon. Annual festivals marked the turning of the agricultural year and the major moments in the divine narrative. The New Year festival at Babylon, the Akitu, was the grandest of these occasions. Over 12 days in the first month of the year, the city enacted a drama that combined royal ritual, divine narrative, and civic renewal. The statue of Marduk was taken from its temple and carried in procession through the city. The king appeared before the god in a ceremony of humbling and restoration. His regalia were temporarily stripped from him, he was struck on the cheek, his ears were pulled, and he knelt before the god to recite a declaration of innocence. If he wept, the omen was good. The regalia were then restored, and the king led the divine procession out to the Akitu house outside the city walls, where the narrative of Marduk's victory over Tiamat was reenacted. This annual ritual was not mere theatre. It was a genuine renewal of the cosmic order, a re-establishment of the proper relationship between divine and human authority, between the rule of Marduk and the delegated authority of his earthly representative, the king. Every year the arrangement was renewed. Every year, the city demonstrated its commitment to maintaining its side of the cosmic bargain. Part 10. The Great Gods and the Human Condition. One of the things that makes the Mesopotamian tradition so interesting to a modern reader is the honesty with which it addresses the human condition. There is remarkably little sentimentality in these texts. The gods are not primarily concerned with individual human happiness. The world is not arranged for human convenience. The arrangement between gods and people is functional, not parental in the warm modern sense. And yet the texts are not cold. There is, running through all of them, a genuine acknowledgement of what it costs to be human, the labor, the vulnerability, the mortality, the grief. And there is equally, as a genuine sense that these costs are not arbitrary or meaningless, but are the result of specific decisions made by specific divine powers for specific reasons. The Gilgamesh epic is the fullest exploration of this theme in Mesopotamian literature, and it remains one of the greatest works of narrative literature ever produced. Its hero, Gilgamesh, is the king of Uruk, historically attested, mythologically amplified into a figure two-thirds divine. He is powerful and handsome, and sometimes tyrannical. He is also, from the moment we meet him, profoundly alive to the world in a way that makes him sympathetic across 4,000 years. The central crisis of the epic is the death of Enkidu, Gilgamesh's great friend, his other self, the one person in the world who was his equal. As Enkidu's death sends Gilgamesh into a grief and a terror that changes him entirely. For the first time, he truly understands what mortality means, and he cannot accept it. He sets out on a journey to find the one human being who has been granted immortality, Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood, who now lives at the edge of the world where the rivers run into the sea. He travels through impossible landscapes. He crosses the waters of death. He arrives. Utnapishtim tells him the story of the flood. He also tells him that immortality is not available to ordinary humans. He sets Gilgamesh a small test. If he can stay awake for 7 days, perhaps the gods will consider his case. Gilgamesh fails immediately. He falls asleep as soon as the test begins. He is given a chance at a plant from the bottom of the sea that restores youth, and if not immortality. He dives for it and retrieves it. And then, resting at a pool on his way home, he sets it down, and a snake eats it. He returns to Uruk empty-handed. He stands before the walls of his city and describes them to his boatmen: the fired brick courses, the high ramparts, the foundation platform. He invites the boatmen to examine what has been built. This, the poem seems to say, is what humans have that animals and gods alike do not have in the same way. The capacity to build something that outlasts a single life, to create structures, physical, social, cultural, that carry meaning forward through time. The Anunnaki are present throughout the epic in their role as the powers that fix destinies. When Enkidu is dying, he has a dream in which he is taken before the assembly of the great gods, who debate whether he is to live or die. The dream describes the divine deliberation in terms that mirror the legal procedures of earthly courts: petitions, arguments, a final decision. The decision is made. Enkidu must die. The great gods have decreed it. There is no appeal. The Gilgamesh epic does not present this as unjust. It presents it as how things are. The gods set the arrangement. Humans work within it. The appropriate response to mortality is not to rail against it or to seek ways around it, but to use the time one has in the fullest possible way, which, in Gilgamesh's case, means building walls and ruling well and loving fiercely and accepting, at the end, that the walls will stand after he is gone. This is a mature and, in some ways, a beautiful vision of the human situation. It is also a vision that resonates strongly with the experience of people who lived, as the Mesopotamians did, in a world of enormous natural forces that could destroy in a season everything that a generation had built. The floods came. The cities were rebuilt. The Anunnaki set destinies. The work continued. Part 11. Modern Afterlives. In the 20th century, the Anunnaki escaped from the academic literature and entered the wider world. And what happened to them there is a story that says as much about our own moment as it does about ancient Mesopotamia. The first wave of popular engagement with the Anunnaki was straightforwardly romantic. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian civilization in the 19th century had produced genuine wonder, and that wonder slowly filtered into public consciousness through museum exhibitions, popular histories, and the growing field of biblical archaeology. People were fascinated by the idea that the stories in their scriptures had roots in an older civilization, that the flood of Noah had an ancestor in the flood of Utnapishtim, that the Garden of Genesis owed something to the gardens of Sumer. This romantic engagement was largely benign. It tended to produce books with titles like The Cradle of Civilization and exhibitions of extraordinary objects. The bull-headed lyre from the royal cemetery at Ur, the blue-glazed tiles of the Ishtar Gate, the stelae of Hammurabi. The Anunnaki, in this context, were part of the texture of ancient religious life, interesting for what they revealed about how our distant ancestors thought about power and justice and the divine. The second wave was less careful and considerably more dramatic. Beginning in the 1970s with the work of Zecharia Sitchin, a new interpretation of the Anunnaki entered popular culture. Sitchin claimed that the ancient Sumerian texts, correctly understood, described not a mythology but a history, specifically a history of contact between ancient humanity and an extraterrestrial civilization. According to his interpretation, the Anunnaki were beings from a hypothetical planet he called Nibiru, which orbited the Sun on a highly elliptical path that brought it into the inner solar system roughly every 3,600 years. These beings had come to Earth in ancient times to mine gold, which they needed to repair their planet's atmosphere. Finding the work difficult, they had used genetic engineering to create a slave race, humanity, from a combination of their own DNA and that of existing hominids. Sitchin's book sold in the millions. They presented themselves as the product of serious scholarship. He claimed special knowledge of Sumerian, Akkadian, and related ancient languages, and they surrounded their central claims with the apparatus of academic argument, citations of tablets, references to archaeological sites, photographs of ancient artifacts. Akkadian and Sumerian specialists were, essentially, unanimously skeptical. The specific translations Sitchin offered for key passages do not correspond to how those passages are read by scholars who have spent decades working with these languages in their full context. The word Nibiru, for example, does appear in some Babylonian astronomical texts. But in those texts, it refers to the planet Jupiter, or sometimes to a specific astronomical crossing point, not to a rogue planet on a centuries-long orbit. The passages that Sitchin described as accounts of rocket ships or genetic laboratories do not read that way in careful translation. They read as mythological narratives in a tradition that scholars have been studying for over 100 years. This does not mean that Sitchin was being dishonest in a simple sense. He was reading texts through a framework that he had decided in advance was correct and finding in them what he was looking for. This is a common human tendency, and it is not confined to amateur scholars, but the specific claims he made about what the text said cannot be sustained under scrutiny. The problem was that Sitchin's framework, was extraordinarily compelling to people who found both conventional religion and conventional science unsatisfying. It offered a grand narrative about human origins that felt scientifically grounded: genetics, astronomy, physical extraterrestrials, while also providing the sense of cosmic purpose and connection that religious narratives traditionally supply. We did not arise by slow evolution from common ancestors. We were made, deliberately, by beings who had specific intentions for us. Our history is part of a larger interstellar story. The gods were real. These are powerful emotional satisfactions. They explain why Sitchin's ideas, despite the scholarly consensus against them, have not only survived, but flourished in the decades since he introduced them. The internet has been particularly hospitable to the Anunnaki as alien theory. Forums, social media channels, YouTube videos with millions of views, and entire subcultures devoted to the idea have grown up around the Nibiru hypothesis and its various elaborations. The scholarly response to this phenomenon has been mixed. Some academics ignore it entirely on the grounds that engaging with it lends it undeserved credibility. Others have argued that the public deserves access to what the actual evidence shows, and that silence from experts leaves the field to the misinformers. The tension between these positions is real and unresolved. What is worth noting is that the Anunnaki as aliens theory, whatever its problems as history or science, is itself an interesting cultural artifact. It tells us something about a contemporary hunger for meaningful origin stories, or for explanations of human existence that exceed what conventional religious traditions offer without requiring literal faith in texts that feel ancient and remote, and for connection to something larger than the individual human life. The Sumerians had exactly the same hunger. They just satisfied it differently. They looked at the rivers and the stars and the complex, sometimes brutal arrangements of civilized life, and they created stories that made sense of all of it. Stories about a divine council that set destinies, about gods who made people to carry work, about a flood that almost ended everything, and the mercy that allowed a new beginning. Those stories were not literally true in the modern empirical sense, but they were true in the sense that mattered to the people who told them. They were honest about the nature of existence, the necessity of labor, the arbitrariness of mortality, and the possibility of survival through intelligence, preparation, and the maintenance of right relationships with the powers greater than oneself. Part 12. What the clay remembers. There is a temptation, when dealing with material as old and strange as the Anunnaki mythology, to treat it as fundamentally exotic, as something radically alien to modern experience, interesting as an artifact, but disconnected from anything that matters now. This temptation should be resisted. The great themes of Sumerian mythology are not exotic. They are the themes that every complex society has had to address. How is power legitimized? What obligations does the powerful have toward the vulnerable? What makes an oath binding? How do we manage resources that belong to everyone but must be maintained by specific people? What happens to the wrong that is never punished in a human lifetime? The Anunnaki tradition's answer to these questions is, at its core, a system. The divine assembly sets the rules. The rules are made known through oracles, omens, and the wisdom preserved in scribal traditions. Kings rule by divine appointment, which means they can be held accountable to standards that transcend their personal interests. Oaths are sworn before witnesses who cannot die and cannot be bribed. Land boundaries are protected by curses that extend beyond the lifetime of anyone alive at the time of the boundary's establishment. This system was not perfect. No system is. But it was functional, and it was sophisticated, and it lasted, in various forms, passing through Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian hands for more than 3,000 years. 3,000 years is a long time for any institutional arrangement to persist. The tablets record its workings in extraordinary detail: the canal rosters, the temple accounts, the legal decisions, the astronomical observations, the royal hymns, the flood stories. What the tablets also record, in a way that is easy to miss, is the emotional texture of life in these cities. The hymns to Inanna are not administrative documents. They are passionate, sometimes overwhelming expressions of devotion to a divine power that the poet experienced as genuinely present and genuinely dangerous. The lament texts composed when cities fell, when the divine patron had, as the Sumerians understood it, abandoned the city and allowed its destruction, are among the most moving expressions of collective grief in all of ancient literature. The literary tradition that grew up around Gilgamesh and Enkidu contains what may be the earliest surviving exploration of male friendship, grief, and the confrontation with mortality. These are not curiosities. They are recognizable human experiences, described with precision and emotional honesty by people who happened to write on clay instead of paper. The gods they worshipped were organized differently from the divine figures most modern people are familiar with. Their cosmology was different, their theories of causation were different. But the needs those cosmological and theological systems addressed, the need for meaning, for accountability, for protection against chaos, is for acknowledgement that labor has value and grief is real, are the same needs that drive religious and philosophical thought today. The Anunnaki, in their original form, were the Sumerian answer to a very specific question. How do you run a civilization? How do you create systems of authority that people will accept, obligations that people will honor, and standards of justice that will hold even when no human enforcer is watching? The answer the Sumerians gave was, you make the standards cosmic. You embed them in the nature of things. You say that the rules that govern canal maintenance and land ownership and honest weights in the marketplace are not merely practical conventions, but reflections of a divine order, an order established by the great assembly of the gods before the first human being drew breath, an order that will persist after the last king has turned to dust. This is not a naive answer. It is, in some respects, a profound one. The insight that stable civilization requires that authority be understood as something more than raw power, that it must be embedded in a framework that transcends the personal interest of those who exercise it, is not a Sumerian insight alone. It appears in every major civilizational tradition. But the Sumerians got there early, and they worked out the details with characteristic thoroughness over thousands of tablets across thousands of years. When we stand before those tablets in museums today, the tiny wedge marks pressed into clay by hands long gone, recording transactions and prayers and stories that the writers themselves may not have expected to survive. We are in the presence of something important, not the presence of aliens or secret masters or cosmic conspirators, the presence of human beings, very much like ourselves, who needed to make sense of a world that was difficult and beautiful and often terrifying, and who did so with intelligence and creativity and a stubborn insistence that the work of making a decent life in a hard world is worth doing carefully and recording honestly. The Anunnaki are the gods of that record. They are the divine framework within which all that work took place. The guarantors, the judges, the council that set destinies and heard petitions and occasionally showed mercy when the rules had been too strictly applied. They are, in the end, a monument to human seriousness about the project of civilization, the belief that the world can be organized, that justice is real, that work has meaning, and that the things we do today will matter to someone we will never meet. That belief, not the alien spaceships, not the secret genetics laboratories, not the planetary orbits measured in millennia, is the real legacy of the Anunnaki. It is a legacy worth taking seriously. It is, in fact, a legacy we are still living inside. Epilogue. The river still runs. The Tigris and the Euphrates are still there. They are diminished, dammed upstream, diverted for irrigation, suffering from the same hydrological pressures that modern industrial civilization has placed on river systems worldwide, but they still run. They still carry, in their annual cycles of flood and drought, some trace of the rhythm that shaped the civilization that named the Anunnaki. The mounds are still there too. Some have been excavated. Most have not. Beneath the flat brown landscape of southern Iraq, thousands of sites remain unexcavated, containing millions of tablets that no modern person has yet read. Each one is a voice from that long conversation about how to organize a life, how to manage a society, how to address the powers greater than oneself with appropriate combination of respect and practicality. The tablets that have been read tell us enough to form a picture. A city in which the temple of the patron god stood at the center of everything, not symbolically, but practically, as the administrative and economic hub of the community. Be a world in which the written word had authority precisely because it was understood as witnessed by powers that could not be deceived. A civilization in which the same system of marks that recorded a delivery of barley could also record the words of a hymn to a goddess of love, because the practical and the sacred were not different categories. And at the center of the sacred architecture of that civilization, the Anunnaki, the High Assembly, the ancient family, the judges of both the living and the dead, the ones who set destinies, who heard petitions, who occasionally argued with each other about the right balance between justice and mercy, who could be moved by a well-made offering and a sincere prayer, who demanded that oaths be kept and boundaries respected and work be done honestly in accordance with the ancient compact. They are not out there in space, orbiting on a planet beyond Neptune. They are here, in these tablets, in these mounds, in the archaeological record of one of the longest continuous civilizations the world has produced. They are the product of human minds grappling with the hardest questions that human minds face. And in that sense, in the only sense that finally matters, they are as present as they have ever been, waiting for anyone who cares to read what the clay has kept.